in Martinsburg. The air inside room 517 of the Sheraton Hotel is thick with trapped humidity and the overwhelming copper scent of standing blood. It is the morning of August 10th, 1991 in Martinsburg, West Virginia. A hotel maid pushes her cleaning cart down the quiet, carpeted hallway, stopping at the door. She knocks, waits for a response, and then slides her master keycard into the electronic lock. She pushes the door open. The curtains are drawn shut, blocking out the late summer sun, and the television is off. The room is dead silent except for the rhythmic, agonizingly slow sound of water dripping from a bathroom faucet. She steps carefully onto the carpet, calling out to the guest. When she reaches the threshold of the bathroom, the routine of her workday ends forever. The floor is slick with dark red fluid. The camera perspective of our narrative locks onto the white bathroom tiles, slowly panning up the side of the porcelain bathtub. The tub is filled to the absolute brim with bloody water. Lying motionless in the center of the water is Danny Casolaro. He's a 44-year-old freelance investigative journalist. His arms rest limp against the sides of the porcelain. His wrists have been slashed a dozen times. Some of the cuts are shallow hesitations, while others are carved incredibly deep, severing the tendons entirely. The water around him is still. The official ruling arrives with absolute certainty and breathtaking speed. The local police take one look at the horrific scene and immediately declare it a tragic, clear-cut suicide. They construct a narrative that fits the visual evidence perfectly. They claim Danny was a paranoid, financially ruined writer who buckled under the weight of his own grand delusions. They point out that freelance journalism is a brutal profession, that he was chasing a conspiracy theory that nobody believed, and that his debts had simply become too heavy to carry. He came to a lonely hotel room off the highway to end his pain. It is a story that makes perfect sense to the general public. It is neat, it is tragic, and it is entirely false. Danny Casolaro did not suffer a psychotic break. He did not succumb to a sudden wave of insurmountable despair. He was systematically hunted. He was cornered in that bathroom and executed in a mathematically precise operation designed specifically to mimic a total psychological collapse. His death was not the end of a sad life, but the termination of a massive liability. He was killed because he had successfully solved the most dangerous puzzle of the 20th century, and the people operating in the shadows could not allow him to share the answer. The bleach and the blood. Before we can understand the massive global conspiracy Danny uncovered, we must look at what happens in the immediate aftermath of his death. This is where the foundation of the official story begins to rot. Within hours of the maid discovering his body, an astonishing sequence of events takes place. Danny's remains are removed from the hotel and transported to a local mortuary. At this point, his family in Virginia has absolutely no idea that he is dead. His brother thinks he is simply away on a reporting trip. No formal next-of-kin notification has been made. No formal autopsy has been authorized by the state or by his loved ones. Yet, inside the quiet rooms of the Martinsburg funeral home, a mortician begins an illegal and rushed embalming process. Embalming is a highly invasive chemical procedure. It involves draining the human body of its natural blood and replacing that fluid with a chemical mixture primarily composed of formaldehyde. The stated purpose of embalming is to preserve the tissue for a funeral viewing. The unstated reality of embalming is that it completely destroys any possibility of a clean toxicology report. By flushing Danny's vascular system with harsh chemicals, the mortician erases all traces of what might have been in his bloodstream at the time of his death. If Danny had been forcibly injected with a paralytic agent to keep him still while his wrists were cut, that evidence is now gone. If he had been drugged with heavy sedatives to render him compliant and unable to fight back against his attackers, that evidence is also gone. The blood that could have told the true story of his final moments is washed down a drain before a medical examiner even has a chance to draw a sample. While the physical evidence inside Danny's body is being chemically destroyed, a parallel operation takes place back at the Sheraton Hotel. Room 517 remains a fresh crime scene. In a standard police investigation, a room where a violent death has occurred is sealed with tape. Detectives take hundreds of photographs. Forensics teams dust for fingerprints on the door handles, the glass cups, and the bathroom surfaces. They look for hair, fibers, and microscopic signs of a struggle. None of this happens in Martinsburg. Instead, an unidentified cleaning crew arrives at the hotel. They do not look like standard hotel housekeeping staff. They carry industrial-grade equipment and heavy chemical solvents. They enter the bathroom and begin to sanitize the entire area with highly concentrated bleach. They scrub the grout between the tiles. They wipe down the porcelain tub. They wash the walls and clean the sink. They erase every drop of blood and every potential fingerprint. The most shocking detail of this entire process is that the local police officers are present. They stand by in the hallway and watch as this unauthorized crew systematically destroys the crime scene. They allow the room to be completely sterilized before a comprehensive forensic investigation can even begin. By the time Danny's family is finally located and informed of his tragic suicide, the physical reality of his death has been completely evaporated. There is no blood to test. There is no room to examine. There is only the official story wrapped in a neat bow, presented to a grieving family who immediately knows that something is terribly wrong. Danny was terrified of needles and blood. He was a man who planned for the future and loved his son deeply. He would never choose to end his life in a bathtub in a roadside hotel. But his protests, and the protests of his family, are silenced by the overwhelming, sterilized emptiness of the evidence. The shadow software. To understand why a team of professionals would go to such extreme lengths to stage a suicide and erase a crime scene, we must rewind the clock and examine the genesis of Danny's investigation. We must understand the object that caused his death. It was not a physical weapon or a briefcase full of stolen money. It was a piece of computer code. In the early 1980s, the world was undergoing a massive transition. The endless rows of paper files and physical filing cabinets that had managed human society for centuries were being replaced by digital databases. The United States Department of Justice was drowning in a backlog of legal cases. They needed a way to track criminals, court dates, witness testimonies, and financial records across multiple different jurisdictions. They needed a computer program that could connect the dots between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. A private technology company called Inslaw created the perfect solution. They developed a revolutionary case management software and named it PROMIS. PROMIS was an acronym for Prosecutors Management Information System. It was a masterpiece of early digital architecture. It could take a massive amount of chaotic data and organize it into clear, actionable intelligence. It could track a suspect's movements, monitor their associates, and predict their next steps based on historical patterns. The Department of Justice signed a lucrative contract with Inslaw to install PROMIS on their mainframe computers. This is where the narrative shifts from a simple business contract into the realm of a global conspiracy. Danny Casolaro discovered that the government did not just want to use the software for domestic legal cases. High-level intelligence operatives recognized that PROMIS was the ultimate espionage tool. If you could track criminals in a courtroom, you could track dissidents, political rivals, and foreign military movements. However, there was a problem. Inslaw owned the software. The government could not simply take it and distribute it to their spy agencies without paying millions of dollars in licensing fees and exposing their operations to civilian audits. So, they decided to steal it. Through a series of complex legal maneuvers, forced bankruptcies, and withheld payments, the Department of Justice drove Inslaw to the brink of ruin and essentially confiscated the PROMIS source code. But the theft of the software was only the first layer of the mystery. Danny tracked the stolen code as it moved out of the civilian justice system and into the dark world of international espionage. He uncovered a terrifying secret. Before the stolen version of Promise was secretly sold to foreign governments, international banks, and allied intelligence agencies, a group of rogue operatives modified the code. They inserted a hidden backdoor into the software architecture. A backdoor is a secret point of entry that allows someone to access a computer system without the owner knowing. The strategy was incredibly brilliant and utterly ruthless. These operatives would approach a foreign government or a massive financial institution and sell them the Promise software, marketing it as the most advanced data management system in the world. The foreign entity would install the software on their most secure classified mainframes. They would input their national secrets, their troop movements, their spy rosters, and their covert banking transactions into the Promise database. They believed their information was perfectly safe because they owned the software. They did not realize that the people who sold them the software possessed a master key. Through the hidden backdoor, the rogue operatives could quietly dial into the foreign mainframes and read every single piece of data. They had successfully convinced the world to pay them for the privilege of being perfectly surveilled. Danny realized he was not just looking at a case of stolen intellectual property. He was mapping out a shadow network of untouchable power brokers. He dubbed this massive, interconnected cabal the Octopus. The Octopus was not a formal organization with a headquarters and a designated leader. It was a fluid alliance of rogue intelligence officers, organized crime syndicates, black market weapons dealers, and corrupt politicians. They used the absolute knowledge gathered from the Promise backdoor to manipulate global events. They knew which banks were moving illicit money, so they could blackmail the bankers. They knew which countries were secretly buying weapons, so they could control the arms trade. They had their hands in everything. They possessed a godlike view of the world's secrets. The stakes of Danny's investigation elevated from a standard true crime story to a systemic global threat. This was about the literal foundation of the modern, inescapable surveillance state. Danny possessed documents, bank records, and sworn testimonies that proved the existence of the backdoor. He carried all of this research in a thick, worn accordion folder. He took that folder everywhere he went. He believed that if he could just get the story published in a major newspaper, the sunlight would destroy the shadows. He believed that the truth was a shield that would protect him. He was fatally wrong. The empty diners. As Danny pushed deeper into the history of the stolen software, his life began to fracture. The Octopus did not respond to his investigation with immediate physical violence. They understood that murdering a journalist in broad daylight creates a martyr and draws massive, unwanted attention. Instead, they utilized a far more sophisticated and terrifying approach. They decided to slowly dismantle his reality. Danny began receiving late-night phone calls at his home in Virginia. He would be sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of paper and empty coffee cups, when the phone would ring. He would pick up the receiver, but nobody would speak. He would hear only the static of a secure line and the steady, calm breathing of a stranger. Sometimes a voice would whisper mathematically precise death threats before abruptly disconnecting. The calls were designed to interrupt his sleep cycles, to keep his adrenaline spiking, and to seed a deep, constant paranoia in his mind. Despite the harassment, Danny refused to stop. He started taking clandestine meetings to gather more evidence. He would drive for hours out into the rural countryside to meet sources in empty roadside diners. These meetings usually took place late at night, under the flickering fluorescent lights of lonely truck stops. Danny would sit in a vinyl booth, nursing a cold cup of coffee, waiting for his contacts to arrive. The script must pause here to aggressively exploit the vast gap in information between what Danny believed and what was actually happening. The audience needs to understand the horrifying reality of these meetings. The viewer is presented with the documented intelligence profiles of the men sliding into the booth across from Danny. These were not innocent government clerks who felt guilty about stealing software. These men were known, lethal, highly compromised black ops contractors. They were individuals who had spent decades operating in the lawless zones of the Cold War. They specialized in psychological warfare, subversion, and the total destruction of human targets. Danny treated them like standard journalistic sources. He asked them questions, took furious notes on his legal pads, and promised to protect their identities. He thought he was conducting interviews. The viewer realizes the sickening truth. Danny was being actively lured. He was not interviewing these men, they were profiling him. The threat was buried entirely under the surface of polite, quiet diner conversations. These operatives would feed Danny small pieces of true information mixed with massive, sprawling lies. They told him about secret government bases, about alien technology, about vast underground bunkers. They did this intentionally to pollute his research. They wanted to make his story so incredibly complicated and bizarre that no respectable newspaper editor would ever agree to publish it. They were actively managing his investigation, steering him away from the hard, provable facts about the software theft and pushing him toward endless, unprovable conspiracy theories. More importantly, they were studying Danny's psychology. They were testing his limits. They watched how his hands shook when he held his coffee cup. They listened to the frantic, desperate tone in his voice. They noted his increasing isolation from his old friends and his growing financial desperation. They were gathering the necessary data to build a psychological profile of a man on the edge of a breakdown. They knew they were eventually going to have to kill him, and they needed to figure out exactly how to stage his death so that it perfectly matched the profile they were creating. The immense suspense of these diner scenes relies entirely on the fact that the audience knows Danny is sitting inches away from his future executioners, while Danny believes he has finally found the people who will help him blow the story wide open. He smiles at them. He shakes their hands. He thanks them for their courage. He is a sheep thanking the wolves for leading him into the forest. There is no cheap gore in these moments. There are no guns drawn or knives flashed. There is only the quiet, overwhelming terror of a trap slowly closing around a man who has absolutely no idea he is already caught. The invisible cage. The psychological terror inflicted upon Danny escalates as he attempts to take his findings public. He begins calling major news outlets and publishing houses, pitching a massive manuscript he intends to call The Octopus. He promises them the story of a lifetime. He promises to expose the software backdoor, the banking scandals, and the global surveillance network. The Octopus realizes that Danny is moving from the research phase into the publication phase. The time for observation is over. The time for active containment has begun. They do not send men to beat him up in an alley. They execute a silent, administrative strangulation. Danny's life begins to fall apart in ways that seem entirely unrelated to his investigation, but are in fact highly coordinated attacks. His mortgage is inexplicably called in by his bank. Despite making his payments, he suddenly faces immediate foreclosure on his home. When he tries to access his savings to hire a lawyer, he discovers that his bank accounts have been frozen due to mysterious administrative errors. He spends hours on the phone with customer service representatives who cannot explain why his money is locked away. He realizes he cannot pay his bills. He cannot buy plane tickets to meet sources. He cannot even afford to fix his car. The financial pressure crushes his ability to operate. At the same time, the physical surveillance becomes undeniable. Danny starts noticing unmarked vehicles parked at the end of his street. Men in dark suits sit inside the cars for hours, doing nothing but watching his front door. When he drives to the grocery store, the cars follow him, making no effort to hide their presence. They want him to know he is being watched. They want him to feel the weight of their gaze every second of the day. He begins to experience the profound psychological terror of a victim entirely deprived of agency. Danny is trapped inside an invisible cage. He realizes that he cannot shoot or punch this enemy, because the enemy is the infrastructure of society itself. The enemy is the banking system, The enemy is the telecommunications network. The enemy is the local police force that ignores his complaints about being stalked. His helplessness becomes absolute. No matter who he calls for help, the network intercepts the plea. When he tries to reach out to his closest confidants, the journalists and friends who used to support him, they suddenly stop returning his calls. They have either been warned away by the authorities, or they have grown exhausted by Danny's increasingly frantic behavior. He is completely isolated. He is financially ruined. He is surrounded by invisible watchers. This phase of the operation is a masterclass in psychological destruction. The operatives have successfully created the exact conditions necessary to justify a suicide. If a man is found dead with no money, no friends, a foreclosed home, and a head full of wild conspiracy theories, the world will easily accept that he took his own life out of despair. The octopus has built the narrative. They have constructed the stage. They have written the final act. All that remains is for the leading man to step onto the set. Danny is pushed to his absolute breaking point. He knows he is running out of time. He knows that his only chance of survival is to find the final, undeniable piece of evidence that will force the mainstream media to listen to him. He receives a call from a source promising exactly that. The source tells him to come to a quiet town in West Virginia. The source tells him to bring the accordion folder. The source tells him to check into the Sheraton Hotel and wait. Danny packs his bags. He believes he is driving toward his salvation. He is actually driving directly into the center of the machine. The final warning. Danny Casolaro knew the walls were closing in around him. The psychological pressure campaign orchestrated by the unseen network had successfully stripped away his financial stability and isolated him from his professional peers. Yet, instead of surrendering, he made a final, desperate push toward the truth. He received a communication from a source promising the ultimate validation of his research. This source claimed to possess the missing documentation that would irrefutably link the stolen Promise software to the highest levels of the intelligence apparatus and international finance. The meeting was set for a hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Before packing his car for the journey, Danny understood the severe risk he was taking. He recognized that stepping out of his routine and traveling to an unfamiliar location made him incredibly vulnerable. He picked up his home telephone and called his brother. The conversation was brief, devoid of dramatic farewells, but anchored by a chilling, specific directive. Danny told his brother that he was heading to the mountains to meet a source who had the final piece of the puzzle. He then spoke the words that would haunt his family for decades. He stated with absolute clarity that if anything happened to him while he was away, under no circumstances should anyone believe it was an accident. He wanted his family to know that he was not suicidal, he was not careless, and he was not giving up. He was walking into the dark deliberately, carrying the weight of the most profound government scandal of the century. He hung up the phone, gathered his thick accordion folder packed with thousands of pages of research, and walked out to his car. The highway to Martinsburg. The drive from his home in Virginia to the Sheraton Hotel in West Virginia was a journey through a landscape that felt increasingly disconnected from the bustling political center of Washington, D.C. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of dark asphalt cutting through the dense Appalachian forests. The heavy late summer air pressed against the windows of his aging car, carrying the stifling humidity of August. Inside the vehicle, the only companion Danny had was the sprawling mass of documents resting on the passenger seat. That accordion folder represented years of his life. It contained dot matrix printouts of financial transfers, sworn affidavits typed on heavy bond paper, and endless yellow legal pads covered in his own frantic handwriting. It held the names of shell companies, rogue intelligence officers, and international arms dealers. As he drove, he likely replayed the complex web of connections in his mind. He believed that he was on the offensive. He believed that the meeting in Martinsburg would finally provide the protective shield of public exposure. He failed to comprehend that the highway he traveled was not a path to victory, but a carefully designed funnel. The individuals who controlled the promised software possessed the ability to monitor telecommunications, track financial movements, and anticipate the behavior of their targets. They knew he was coming. They had chosen the location. Martinsburg was quiet, unassuming, and far enough away from major media centers to ensure a delayed response from the press. The isolation of the rural landscape provided the perfect canvas for a controlled operation, the architecture of isolation. Danny arrived at the Sheraton Hotel and parked his car in the sprawling, sun-baked asphalt lot. The hotel was a standard mid-level establishment designed for weary travelers and minor business conventions. It offered no distinct character, which was exactly why it served as the ideal environment for a covert intelligence operation. Hotels represent a unique form of temporary anonymous housing. People enter and exit constantly, carrying varying amounts of luggage, leaving no permanent imprint on the space. The staff is trained to respect the privacy of the guests and to ignore minor irregularities. Danny walked through the glass sliding doors of the lobby, approached the front desk, and checked in. The interaction was entirely mundane. He received a plastic keycard, gathered his belongings, and made his way to the 5th floor. When he unlocked the door and stepped into room 517, he entered a space designed for total isolation. The room featured standard floral patterned bedspreads, a heavy television set, a small desk, and a standard ensuite bathroom. The window overlooked the parking lot and the highway beyond. The thick curtains could be drawn to block out the harsh summer sun, encasing the room in artificial twilight. The heavy, fire-rated door sealed the room off from the hallway, muffling the sounds of other guests. In this sterile environment, Danny was completely severed from his support system. He had no neighbors to hear a struggle, no windows that offered a view to pedestrians, and only a single landline telephone connecting him to the outside world. He placed his accordion folder on the desk and began the agonizing process of waiting for a contact who would never arrive. The waiting game. The hours ticking by inside room 517 represent a descent into profound psychological torment. Danny likely spread his documents across the bed, reviewing the names and the banking codes, preparing his questions for the source. He wanted to be ready to cross-reference the new evidence with his existing research. As the afternoon stretched into the evening, the silence of the room would have become deafening. The only sounds were the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit and the occasional rattle of an ice machine down the hall. He drank coffee. He paced the floor. He checked his watch repeatedly. Every time a car engine revved in the parking lot below, he might have looked out the window, hoping to see his contact pulling into an empty space. Every time footsteps echoed in the carpeted hallway outside his door, his heart rate would elevate, anticipating a knock. But the knock never came. The source was a phantom, a digital lure cast out by the intelligence network to draw him into a defensible, isolated kill zone. The psychological toll of this wait cannot be overstated. The network wanted him exhausted. They wanted him fraught with anxiety. They understood that a man who has been awake for hours, burning adrenaline in a state of high anticipation, becomes physically and mentally depleted. This depletion was a necessary component of the operation. A tired man is less capable of fighting back. A desperate man makes mistakes. As the sun set and darkness consumed the West Virginia mountains, the reality of his situation began to solidify. The meeting was a lie. The promise of the final puzzle piece was a fabrication designed to separate him from the safety of his home. The mechanics of the trap. To understand the horrific perfection of the trap, we must examine the tactical advantages of a hotel room from the perspective of an assassination team. The operatives hunting Danny did not want a chaotic street encounter. They required an environment where they could control all variables. Room 517 provided a single point of entry, which meant they only had to secure one door to prevent an escape. The thick walls and heavy carpets absorbed sound, minimizing the risk of alerting other guests. Furthermore, modern hotel security systems rely on electronic keycards. The individuals involved in the Promise software scandal possess deep connections to global intelligence agencies and the technology sector. Acquiring a master code to bypass a commercial hotel lock would require minimal effort. They could enter the room without forcing the door, leaving no physical evidence of a break-in. This lack of forced entry is a critical element in staging a convincing suicide. If a door is battered down, the police immediately suspect foul play. If a door is found locked from the inside or shows no signs of tampering, the default assumption shifts toward a self-inflicted event. The operators plan to use the architecture of the hotel against Danny, turning his temporary sanctuary into a soundproof execution chamber, the slipping of time. The pacing of the narrative must slow down to an agonizing crawl as the operation enters its final violent phase. We must focus on the micro-actions that define the absolute terror of the moment. Danny is alone in the room. The silence is absolute, broken only by the slow, rhythmic sound of water dripping from the bathroom faucet. A single drop forms on the metal aerator, swells with gravity and falls, striking the porcelain sink with a sharp, hollow echo. The air conditioning unit hums a steady, monotonous drone. Danny stands near the desk, looking at his scattered papers, the exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. Suddenly, the ambient pressure in the room shifts. It is a microscopic change, the kind of subtle atmospheric fluctuation that occurs when a large volume of air moves in an enclosed space. Someone has stepped into the hallway outside his door. Danny freezes. He stops breathing, straining his ears to listen. He hears the faint, almost imperceptible sound of heavy fabric brushing against the wall. He looks toward the entryway. The thin sliver of yellow light shining under the hotel room door is abruptly eclipsed by a dark, motionless shadow. Someone is standing directly on the other side of the heavy wood. The silence stretches for a torturous amount of time. Danny realizes he is entirely trapped. He cannot run toward the door, and the window offers a 5-story drop to the concrete below. He watches the metal handle of the door. Then comes the sound. It is not a violent kick or the heavy thud of a battering ram. It is the quiet, terrifyingly metallic sliding of a master keycard entering the electronic lock. The lock mechanisms whir for a fraction of a second, followed by a solid mechanical click. A lock that should only open for Danny Casolaro has been bypassed effortlessly. The heavy door swings open, pushing the stale air of the hallway into the room. The heavy, synchronized footsteps of multiple individuals cross the threshold. The men entering the room do not wear ski masks or carry silenced pistols drawn. They are professionals, dressed in unremarkable clothing, carrying specialized equipment designed for restraint and medical compliance. The agonizing seconds of Danny standing in the center of the room, listening to the door close and lock behind the intruders, represent the purest form of human terror. He realizes the final trap has snapped shut. He realizes the scope of the power he challenged. He realizes there is absolutely no way out, and that the men in his room intend to erase his existence while leaving his body behind as a message. The erasure. The events that follow the breach of room 517 are calculated, brutal, and entirely devoid of passion. The operatives do not hate Danny. They view him as a logistical problem that requires a biological solution. To stage a convincing suicide by exsanguination, the victim must be incapacitated but alive, as a dead heart cannot pump blood out of the body. The intruders overpower him with overwhelming physical force, likely utilizing a chemical agent or a powerful muscle relaxant to render him immobile while keeping his circulatory system active. They drag him into the bathroom. They fill the porcelain bathtub with warm water. The temperature of the water is a crucial detail in their grim equation. Warm water prevents blood vessels from constricting, ensuring a rapid and continuous flow of blood from the wounds. They place Danny into the water. Using a blade, They inflict a dozen precise lacerations on his wrists. They intentionally create shallow hesitation marks to mimic the psychological struggle of a man working up the courage to end his own life, before severing the tendons with deep, final cuts. The operatives then conduct a thorough sweep of the hotel room. They gather the accordion folder containing his life's work. They take his notes, his tapes, and his index cards. They leave behind the mundane items, his clothes, his wallet, his keys, to complete the illusion of a standard traveler who simply gave up. They ensure the room shows no signs of a struggle. The pillows remain neat on the bed. The desk chair remains upright. They step back out into the hallway, pulling the heavy fire-rated door shut behind them, hearing the lock click into place. They walk down the hall, descend the stairs, and vanish into the humid West Virginia night. They leave Danny Casolaro to slowly bleed to death in the silent, flooded bathtub, knowing that the physical evidence of their presence will soon be destroyed by the illegal embalming and the unauthorized cleaning crew. The false narrative. When the sun rose the next morning and the hotel maid made her gruesome discovery, the trap completed its final objective. The narrative was instantly seized and molded by the authorities. The local police, lacking the resources and the imagination to comprehend a coordinated intelligence assassination, took the path of least resistance. They looked at a dead man in a bathtub with slashed wrists and declared it a suicide. This immediate classification is the most powerful weapon the octopus possessed. Once a death is labeled a suicide, the investigative machinery grinds to a halt. Detectives stop looking for suspects. They stop pulling phone records. They stop checking security cameras. The focus shifts entirely to the victim's state of mind. The media, fed by official police reports, began to construct a retroactive profile of Danny that perfectly justified his supposed actions. They painted him as a struggling writer chasing a phantom conspiracy. They highlighted his financial troubles, which the network had deliberately caused, as the primary motive for his despair. They framed his frantic phone calls and his claims of being followed as symptoms of a deteriorating mental state. The false narrative became the accepted reality because it was comfortable. Society prefers to believe that a man can simply lose his mind and take his own life. That is a sad, ordinary tragedy. The alternative, that a shadow network of government operatives and international criminals can murder an American citizen in a domestic hotel room and order the local police to cover it up, is a terrifying concept that shatters the illusion of safety and justice. By controlling the crime scene, the network dictated the story. They erased Danny the journalist and created Danny the paranoid victim, the true contents. We must now zoom out from the tragic confines of that hotel room and re-evaluate the entire scope of the narrative. For decades, the accepted conspiracy theory surrounding the death of Danny Casolaro was that he was murdered to prevent him from exposing the theft of the promised software. People believed he was killed to protect the identities of the corrupt officials who stole the code and sold it for profit. This theory, while compelling, fails to grasp the true magnitude of the horror. It focuses on a crime of the past. The ultimate mind-bending reality of the situation is buried in the exact nature of the documents Danny carried in that missing accordion folder. Danny did not just possess proof of a software theft. He possessed proof of a global implementation. The promised software was no longer just a stolen database program. It had become the central nervous system of the modern world. The rogue operatives had successfully integrated the backdoored software into the digital architecture of every major banking institution on Earth. They had installed it in the mainframes of allied and enemy intelligence agencies. They had woven it into the civilian telecommunications grids, the air traffic control systems, and the municipal water supplies. The hidden backdoor allowed this shadow network to read every financial transaction, monitor every classified communication, and track the movement of every individual whose name entered a digital registry. The accordion folder contained the terrifying proof that the invisible cage was not a future threat. It was a present reality, the global implementation. The reason the operatives did not panic when Danny began investigating the theft is because the theft no longer mattered. You cannot arrest the people who control the very system that generates the arrest warrants. The octopus was not afraid of legal repercussions because they possessed absolute leverage over the judges, the politicians, and the prosecutors. If a senator tried to open an investigation, the network simply utilized the promised backdoor to download the senator's private banking records, their illicit affairs, and their hidden communications. Leverage is the ultimate currency of power. By distributing this compromised software across the globe, the network had transitioned humanity from a physical world of localized secrets into a digital world of absolute transparency for the rulers and absolute opacity for the ruled. Danny was not executed to prevent an investigation from starting. He was executed because the omnipotent system he was trying to warn the world about was already online and fully operational. His murder was not a desperate cover-up by frightened criminals. It was a triumphant beta test. The network wanted to prove to themselves that their control over the system was so absolute that they could murder a prominent journalist in plain sight in a domestic hotel and force the local authorities to certify it as a suicide. They used their financial influence to bankrupt him, their surveillance tools to track him, and their institutional leverage to order the destruction of the crime scene and the illegal embalming of his body. They erased a human being using the very administrative tools he was trying to expose. The death of Danny Casolaro was a demonstration of supreme, untouchable power, the digital panopticon. This realization forces a profound recontextualization of the story you are currently absorbing. You are not merely listening to the tragic history of a dead journalist from the early 1990s. You are listening to the hidden origin story of the inescapable digital panopticon that currently defines your daily existence. The promised software was the grandfather of all modern mass surveillance. The concept of a hidden backdoor, pioneered by those rogue operatives, became the standard operating procedure for the global intelligence apparatus. The invisible cage that drove Danny to his doom has expanded exponentially. Consider the device you are using right now. Consider the endless streams of data you willingly generate every single day. Your financial transactions, your physical locations, your private messages, and your search histories are all logged, categorized, and stored in vast digital databases that operate on the foundational logic established by the Promise architecture. We no longer need to be tricked into installing compromised software on classified mainframes. We purchase the surveillance devices ourselves, carry them in our pockets, and sleep with them resting on our nightstands. The terrifying reality is that Danny died trying to prevent a dystopian future that we now willingly accept as the cost of modern convenience. The octopus did not fade away into history. They won. They built the infrastructure of the 21st century, and we are all living inside their database. The helplessness that Danny felt in his final days, the realization that the enemy is the infrastructure itself, is the exact same helplessness that defines the modern condition. There is no escaping the network because the network is everywhere. The next layer. If you want to understand how these exact intelligence protocols and psychological warfare tactics were refined and eventually tested on an entire unsuspecting American population, you need to see how deep the next layer goes. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the terrifying experiment that turned a quiet rural town into a real-world surveillance laboratory and discover the true cost of the invisible cage we all live in today.